He found her beneath the snow, with a locket that bore his own photograph. The snow had a sound to it that morning. Not the soft quiet most people talk about when the flakes are coming down. That was a different kind of snow altogether. This was the wind-packed crust on top of a hard drift, and when it gave all at once, a sound like a board cracking clean over a knee. I heard it from 20 yards off and stopped walking. The dog heard it too. Remus, big gray mutt, half-wolf by the look of him, not a lick of wolf in his manners, went rigid beside me, one paw up, nose forward, and that was enough. I'd learned to trust that dog's stillness better than I trusted most men's talking. I worked around to the uphill side. Elk, I figured, or mule deer bedded down low in the ravine, maybe a coyote that broken through chasing something. The trapping line ran another 4 miles yet, and I had 6 sets to check, and the sky was the color of old pewter, meaning more weather by midday. I didn't have time to be curious about sounds. Then Remus whined. He didn't bark. He never barked at game. He whined the way he did at a hurt thing, a sound he made maybe twice in the years I'd had him, and both times it had been at something that needed help rather than something to be afraid of. I changed my angle and came at the drift from the east. She was in it up to her chest. I stood there a moment, just looking, because the mind doesn't take things like that in all at once. You see a shape, and then you sort the shape out, the dark wool of a coat, the pale skin of a cheek against the white, a glove on one hand and the other bare and the bare fingers blue. I'd been alone long enough that part of me wondered for a second if I was seeing right. I went to her and put 2 fingers along her throat and found a pulse, thin and too fast, the way a pulse goes when the cold has been working on a body for a while. "All right," I said. I don't know who I said it to. I got her up out of the drift by main force, which was harder than it sounds. She was packed in there, fallen, I reckoned, off the trail above, which ran along the ridge maybe 30 feet up. The snow had swallowed her and she'd fought some. You could see where her arms had churned, but fighting a snowdrift when you're already cold will burn the last of what you've got, and she'd gone still. I got her over my shoulder in a carry I hadn't used in a long time. She wasn't a small woman, but she wasn't heavy in a fed way, more the weight of someone who'd been on the trail a while. Remus walked ahead of me on the way back. He does that when I have my hands full, just goes slow enough I can follow the gray of him in the gray light. The cabin sat at the head of a draw, maybe 2 miles from where I found her. I'd built it 14 years ago when I came up here the first time and liked the country enough to stay. Spruce logs, low roof, sod packed over the shake, a stovepipe I'd remortared twice. It wasn't a handsome place. It was tight and it held heat, and that was what mattered. I kicked the door open and got her down on the cot. There was only one cot, same one I slept on, and got the fire going hard. Birch splits on top of the coals I'd banked that morning, then the damper open. The stovepipe began to ping as the metal heated up. Her coat was soaked through, her boots too. I pulled them off, the boots first, then worked the coat off her shoulders, the way you do with somebody drunk or very young working around a dead weight. The glove she had on had done some good. That hand was cold but not black. The bare hand was worse. I wrapped it in flannel and tucked it against her side. She was wearing a dress under the coat, gray wool, and over it a canvas vest with pockets. Working clothes, not traveling clothes, which is to say she'd packed for utility, not for looks. There was a canteen on her belt and a folding knife, a short blade utility thing which I left where it was. She'd earned that, I figured. I covered her to the chin with the 2 blankets I had, and the buffalo robe I kept on the peg by the door for nights when it dropped hard. Then I made coffee because I needed something to do with my hands, and because hot liquid was the first useful thing once she came around. The dog lay down across the door, the way he always did in weather. I sat in the one chair I had, about 3 feet from the cot, and I watched her breathe. Her face, now that I could look at it straight, mid-30s maybe, hard to tell exactly. Wind-darkened skin, which was a person who'd been outside a long time. Dark hair, loose now, cut shorter than fashion but long enough to be practical. A scar on her chin, old and faded, the kind you get from a fall in childhood. High cheekbones. A kind face, I thought, and then felt foolish for thinking it. I didn't know her from Adam. She was a stranger in my country, half frozen, and everything else was my mind filling in gaps it had no business filling. I drank my coffee, she breathed. I thought, as I sat there, about the particular quality of quiet that comes with an unconscious person in a small room. It was different from the usual quiet of the cabin, which was a quiet I'd grown accustomed to, the way you grow accustomed to the sound of your own heartbeat, present and not present at the same time. This was a weighted quiet, a quiet with another person's gravity in it. I noticed, sitting there with my coffee cooling in my hand, that I hadn't been in a room with another living person, not counting Remus, who was his own category, in better than 4 months. The nearest neighbor was a trapper named Cutler who ran lines to the west of mine, and we crossed paths twice a season at best, exchanged information about weather and game, and went our ways. Before that, a brief conversation at the trading post in Harker's Ford, which didn't really count because those conversations were about pelts and credit and had no other dimension to them. 4 months. I'd have said that was fine, and it was fine, and yet here I was noticing the weight of her breathing. An hour, maybe more, before she started to come back. I could see it before she opened her eyes, a shift in the stillness, the way a person moves when the mind is beginning to work again beneath the surface. Her bare hand flexed once inside the flannel. Then she opened her eyes, and the first thing she did was try to sit up. "Easy," I said. She looked at me. She didn't say anything for a moment. The brown of her eyes, dark, clear, taking me in the way someone takes in a thing they are examining rather than just looking at. Not afraid. That surprised me. She'd woken up in a stranger's cabin in the mountains in winter, and she wasn't afraid. "How long?" she said. Her voice was rough, barely there. "Couple hours. Don't try to sit up yet." She lay back, my hand. The right one came through fine. The left one was bare. I wrapped it. "You'll keep it." She exhaled, closed her eyes again, not in unconsciousness but in something like relief. Her lips moved. I didn't catch the word. "What?" I said. "Thank you," she said louder. I poured the coffee into a second cup I had, tin, dented from a fall, and brought it to her. Helped her hold it because her left hand wasn't useful yet. She drank like someone who needed it badly, and was still polite enough not to drain it in one go. After a while I said, "What's your name?" "Nora," she said, "Nora Vance." I told her mine. She said it back to me, and there was something in how she said it. Not recognition exactly, or maybe exactly that. She slept again after the coffee. Real sleep this time, not the cold unconsciousness from before. I went out and checked the closest sets, 2 Martin, 1 empty, and came back before the light went. The sky had done what I'd predicted, dropping another 2 inches while I was out, but it was soft snow now, no wind, the kind that comes down in big slow flakes and doesn't cause trouble unless it comes for days. It wasn't coming for days. I could feel it in the air, that particular damp cold that means snow is finishing rather than starting. She was awake when I got back in, sitting up, the buffalo robe around her shoulders. I made broth from what I had, dried venison and root vegetables I kept in a tin box, and she ate it without ceremony, the bowl held in both hands because the left one was coming back to her, and she wanted to use it. "Your trail," I said, "the one above the ravine, how long had you been on it?" 2 days from Harker's Ford," she said. Harker's Ford was 18 miles. She'd come 18 miles in mountain winter on a trail I wouldn't have taken in this weather, not without a good reason. "Alone," I said. "Alone. What were you looking for?" She set the bowl down on the edge of the cot. She looked at me for a long beat in the way she'd done when she'd first woken up, that straight, weighing look. "You," she said. I didn't say anything. She reached inside the canvas vest, I'd hung it on the peg near the stove to dry and found the inner pocket, and her fingers worked at something in there. Her left hand fumbled. Her right did the work, and what she brought out was a locket on a chain, small, oval, brass gone green with age and handling. She held it out to me. I took it, opened it. The photograph on the left side was a woman I knew, had known. Margaret, my wife. She'd been dead 11 years, and I hadn't seen a photograph of her in 8, since the last one I'd had burned with the cabin I built before this one. In the photograph she was young, younger than I remembered her being even in our early years, which meant it had been taken before she and I ever met. She was looking at the camera with a slight tilt to her chin that was so much her I had to stop and just breathe for a second. The photograph on the right side was a man in front of a building I knew. Stone building, 2 stories, back in a town I'd left 30 years ago. The man was younger, considerably, but the face was mine. I looked up at Nora Vance. She was my mother's sister, Nora said. Margaret, my aunt. I couldn't produce a word. She talked about you, Nora said. She talked about you for years. My mother thought she ought to stop, but she never really did. When she died 3 years ago, she left me her things. She nodded at the locket in my hand. That was in the box she left. I recognized her in it. I didn't know who the man was, not for a long time. How? I started and had to clear my throat. How did you find out? She kept letters. A lot of letters. Yours weren't in the box. I don't think she kept yours, or maybe she got rid of them before she died. I don't know. But there were letters from a woman named Clara Budd who you'd both known, and Clara mentioned you enough times that I started to understand what Margaret had, what there'd been between you and her before. I put the locket down on my knee. Before. That word carried the weight of a whole other life. Margaret and I had been young, and it had been real, and then it had ended the way some things end, not in a fight, not in a betrayal, but in the grinding way that distance and time and the plans of other people erode a thing until it's gone. She'd married a man her family chose for her. I'd gone west. By the time I heard she'd married someone named Vance and had a daughter and a life, there wasn't anything to do with the information except carry it. I had my own life by then. Separate. Complete in its way. She never said anything against you, Nora said. I want you to know that. She spoke of you like you were someone worth speaking of, like you'd been good to her. She paused. Were you? It was a plain question, asked plainly, not an accusation, just a woman who'd loved her aunt and wanted to know. I tried to be, I said. We were young. I don't know that I knew how to be what she needed. I was better at going than I was at staying back then. Nora nodded. There was no judgment in it, just the nod of someone taking in a true thing. She wasn't well enough to travel for 4 days. The left hand needed watching. There was some frostbite in the outer fingers that didn't turn black, which was luck, but she couldn't do much with that hand for the first 2 days and then could only do careful things. I gave her the cot and slept rolled in the spare blanket in front of the stove. Remus moved between us like he was keeping watch on both, which I let him do. We talked. Not constantly, neither of us was a constant talking person, but in the way 2 people will when they're cabin-bound, and there's nothing to do but weather the weather. I found out about her, that she was 37, widowed 4 years prior, a man named Cal Vance who'd been her father's foreman, and then her husband, and who died of a lung sickness that took him faster than anyone expected. No children. She'd been running her father's ranch in the territory south of the mountains since her father lost his sight, which was the kind of thing you said in one sentence, but which was in fact an enormous amount of life compressed into a small space. She asked about the trapping, about the trap lines, and how a man organized his winter that way, what you checked first, how you chose where to set. She asked about Remus, how I'd come to have him. She asked about the country, not the dramatic version that travelers want, the big peaks and the hard weather, but the specific version, the particular character of this piece of land, what distinguished it from the country 20 miles in any direction. Those were the questions of a woman who worked land herself, a woman who understood that land had character and that understanding it was practical, not sentimental. I answered what she asked. I wasn't, by nature, a man who talked at length about himself, but I found I could talk at length about the country, and she received it the way a person receives information they're genuinely going to use. "Why up here?" she said one evening. "There's good trapping country in the valley too." It was the right question, and I gave her the honest answer, which was that I'd come up here the same year Margaret died, not from grief directly but from a reckoning, an accounting of a life that had been spent in motion and had arrived nowhere in particular, and that the mountains, with their demand and their silence, had suited a man who needed to stop moving and couldn't think of another way to do it. She listened and didn't offer anything in return for a moment, which was the right thing to do. Some things you receive and don't balance against your own. Then she said, "My father says stillness is something you have to earn. That people who were busy a long time need to learn it the hard way, same as people learn cold." "Your father sounds like he knows something," I said. "He knows a great deal," she said. "He's just mostly blind now, which inconveniences him enormously." There was a dry affection in how she said it, the way you talk about a person who exasperates and sustains you in equal measure. "Why come here?" I said one evening, the fire low, the wind doing what it does in that country when it means it. "Why come all this way for a photograph?" She turned the tin cup in her hands. She had her hands around it for warmth. "Because she mattered," Nora said. "Because she carried you all her life and I wanted to know who you were, whether you were worth the carrying." She looked up. "That sounds harsh." "It sounds honest," I said. "She had a good life with my uncle, a decent life, but there was something she kept apart in herself, and I didn't understand it until after she died and I read those letters and started to piece together what it was, who it was." She set the cup down. "I'm not angry with you. I don't want you to think that's what this is. I'm not here to take something back. I wanted to see you." "Why?" I said. And I meant it as a simple question, not a challenge. She thought about it. She was a woman who thought about things before she said them, which I'd noticed by then and appreciated. "Because she loved you," Nora said, "and she never let go of it, even when she let go of you. And when she died, the part of her that had always been turned toward you, I suppose, that part of her had nowhere left to go." She was quiet for a second. "So I came." The fire cracked. The wind pressed at the shakes overhead. "She was a good woman," I said. I wasn't sure why I said it. It felt like something that needed saying. "She was," Nora said. Third morning, before the weather changed, she had been at the stove making coffee because her hands were good enough to do it, and she'd asked to be useful. I was outside splitting kindling on the chopping block, and when I came back in she'd also fried the last of the salt pork I'd been putting off frying, because salt pork is better fresh, and once you fry it, you've got nothing left to look forward to. She set the plate down on the table without ceremony, like she'd been doing it for years. "Sit," she said. I sat. We ate the salt pork. It was good. Better than it had any right to be, which is a thing that sometimes happens with simple food in cold weather, and also with company you hadn't expected. Fourth day the weather broke. It didn't go warm. It's never warm up there in that season, but the wind laid down, and the sky went from pewter to a flat pale blue, which means traveling weather as long as you're not fussy. She would have to go. She was up before me and already had the vest on, and was working at her boot laces with both hands, the left one slower but useful. I sat up and watched her for a moment without saying anything. "You don't have to leave today," I said. "The light'll hold another day. Your hand." "My hand is fine," she said. She wasn't wrong. "My father's got men, but he's still better when I'm there. I've been gone too long already." She got the second boot on and looked up. "I'm not leaving because I want to." Something moved in my chest at that. Something I hadn't felt move in a long time, and so I didn't quite know what it was for a beat, and then I did. "I'll take you down to the main trail," I said. You don't have to. I know that. I'm doing it anyway. She looked at me in that straight way she had, then she nodded. We walked down through the spruce in the pale morning light, her ahead and me behind on the narrow places, side by side where the trail opened up. Remus worked out ahead of us both. The snow was solid underfoot, good conditions, and we made time. At the fork where the main trail dropped south toward the valley, we stopped. Harker's Ford was a long day's walk from there, maybe more with the snow. Not dangerous, not now that the weather had lifted, but long. You know this country, I said, from here. Well enough, she said. She stood there with her hands in her coat pockets, and her breath coming in small clouds in the cold air. The locket was around her neck, the chain just visible at her collar. She'd offered it back to me the morning of the second day, and I'd said no. I didn't know how to explain why I'd said no. It just hadn't seemed right taking it. It was hers. Nora, I said. She looked up. When things settle enough that you can be gone for a few weeks. I stopped. I was not a man who spoke this way, had not been for a long time, and I wasn't sure I was doing it right. Yes, she said, like she already knew the end of it. I'll come down, I said, to the valley if you'll let me. She looked at me for a long time. The pale winter sky was huge behind her, a silence that had mass to it, a silence I waded in without fidgeting. She always said you could sit still, Nora said. That you could wait without making everyone uncomfortable. She said most men couldn't do that. She was right about most men, I said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the beginning of one. Come in the spring, she said, when the pass is clear. I will. She reached out then, her right hand, the good one, and put it against my chest, against the heavy wool of my coat. Not a hold, not an embrace, just a touch. Flat-palmed, steady, the way you put your hand on something to feel that it's real. She held it there for a count of 3, maybe 4, and looked at me while she did it, and I understood that it was the truest thing she knew how to do in that moment. I covered her hand with mine, just for that same moment. Then she dropped it and stepped back and turned south on the trail, and Remus watched her go, and I watched her go, and the spruce trees stood their dark shapes in the white world all around. I want to tell you what it was like after. When you've lived a certain length of time stripped down, pared back to just what's necessary, just what works, you forget what fullness felt like. You think you remember it, but you remember the idea of it, the outline, same as a man who hasn't eaten in a long while can tell you what bread tasted like but can't quite bring the actual taste up in his mouth. He knows it was good. He doesn't have it. Walking back up to the cabin, I had it. Not the whole of it, not yet. But the beginnings, the start of a thing returning that I'd thought was done returning. I walked through my own spruce trees in the cold, and I was aware of the cold in a way I hadn't been in years, aware of the sky and the silence and the particular weight of the morning, which was the weight of a morning that had more in it than the day before. The locket she'd brought 18 miles in mountain winter to find me. A woman carrying something her aunt couldn't lay down. Standing at the fork and saying, "Come in the spring." I went back inside and fed the fire. I kept the traps through the rest of that winter as usual, ran the lines, made my trades at Harker's Ford when the weather allowed. Traded beaver and marten and one extraordinarily large lynx pelt that got me more than I expected. I was told by the man at the trading post that a woman had been through a few months back, inquiring after me, before she'd gone up into the mountains herself. He described her well enough. "You know her," he said. "I know her," I said. He was a man who knew better than to ask more, and he nodded and wrote up my credit. I spent that winter in the normal ways, but it was different in one important respect. I was planning something. Not planning in the detailed sense. I didn't have much to plan with, no particular prospects or property worth talking about, not the kind of things that make plans easy to sketch out. But planning in the way a body plans when it intends to be somewhere specific. when the future has a direction to it that it hasn't had in a while. I thought about her at odd times. When I was setting a trap in the cold half-dark before sunrise, pressing the iron into the frozen bank of a creek, my breath coming in short bursts from the effort, my fingers sure in their thick gloves. When the wind was bad enough to keep me inside, and I had to fill the hour some other way, oiling the trap mechanisms, mending where the blanket had frayed, reading the one book I kept up here, which was a surveyor's manual I'd had since the 60s and had read more times than I could count simply because I liked the precision of it. I thought about what she'd said. She carried you all her life. Not as a reproach, as a fact. I didn't know what to do with it fully, but it stayed in my chest the way certain cold mornings stay, as a particular feeling rather than as a thought. The idea that a woman had gone to her grave with the weight of something she'd never resolved, and that her daughter had walked 18 miles in mountain winter as a way of resolving it, on behalf of a woman she'd loved, without being asked. I thought about my wife too, the wife I had, the one I'd married 10 years after Margaret, a woman named Ruth who'd been good and steady and who I'd loved in the real plain way that isn't dramatic but that wears well. Ruth had died of a fever 8 years into our marriage, and it had been a grief that aged me, a real grief, not the hollow kind. She'd known a little about Margaret, not everything, but enough. You don't keep everything in a marriage, but the things that matter, a good woman finds a way to receive. Ruth had been that kind of woman. I thought, the women I'd been lucky enough to have in my life. The way luck is the wrong word, but there isn't a right one. And then I thought about Nora Vance on a ranch with an aging blind father and no husband and no children, and a piece of her aunt's heart she'd been carrying through the mountains to find where it belonged. That woman had come looking for me when she didn't have to. The kind of woman who does something like that is the kind of woman who acts on what she believes rather than on what's convenient. I'd known enough people in my life to know that was not common. Most people, given a choice between what they believe and what's easy, find a way to believe something easier. But every now and then you come across someone who doesn't do it that way, who goes where conviction takes her even when the trail's been closed by weather and sensible people have stayed home. The spring felt, for the first time in years, like something to arrive at rather than something to wait through. I ran the lines through February and into March. The Lynx and Martin were good that year, better than the year before, and I had more to trade than usual. There is a particular satisfaction in being competent at a thing, in knowing the country and what it holds and how to read it. I had always had that satisfaction, even in the stripped-down years. But that winter I noticed it more. I noticed the whole of what I was doing more, the clean, cold air at first light, the way the snow held the track of a marten for days in still weather, the feel of a good set. Noticed it and appreciated it in the way you appreciate a thing when you've started to imagine showing it to someone. That was the change. That was the thing I couldn't have told you was missing until it started coming back. I am not a man given to self-examination as a pastime, too many years of just doing what needed doing. But that winter I caught myself turning things over, not worrying them, just turning them, the way you'd turn a stone in your hand. What she'd said, what she'd meant by coming. What it meant that a woman had walked 18 miles to find the face of a man who'd mattered to her aunt. What I intended to do about it, and whether doing something about it was the right call for a man my age with my particular history of staying and going. I came down at the question from different angles over the course of that winter and arrived at the same place each time. Some things you just know, not with certainty, not in the way you know a fact, but in the way your body knows to pull your hand back from a fire or lean into a wind that's trying to push you. The organism knows before the mind catches up. My organism that winter knew. The spring felt, for the first time in years, like something to arrive at rather than something to wait through. The passes cleared in the 3rd week of April, earlier than usual, which I took as information. I broke down the cabin, banked the fire, sealed the smoke hole, fixed the door latch, and shouldered my pack and went down out of the mountains with Remus at my heels. 3 days to the valley bottom, then another day and a half south along the river road to find the Vance property, which was not hard to find once I was close enough to ask. A ranch in that country with a name attached has a presence. People know where it is, the way land carries its lineage in those places. I came up the road in the late afternoon light with the mountains purple behind me and the valley floor already in shadow, the ranch buildings gold-lit and solid in the middle distance. A working ranch, visibly, the corrals in good repair, horses in them, a man on the fence watching them, another moving between the barn and the main house with something on his shoulder. She was in the kitchen garden, or what would be a kitchen garden when things were growing. Right now it was turned earth and stakes with string between them marking out the rows. She had a rake and she was working methodically along one of the furrows, and she heard me before she saw me, the sound of boots on the road, and she straightened and turned. She looked at me across the distance, 50 yards or so in the late light, straight, weighing, taking me in. Then she set the rake against the fence post and walked toward me. I stopped where I was and waited. She came up and stopped a few feet short of me. She was wearing a work apron over her dress and there was soil on her hands and a smudge of it on her cheek from where she'd pushed her hair back. She looked well, better than she'd looked in the cabin, though in the cabin she'd had the excuse of nearly dying. Here she was in her own place, in her element, and she looked like what she was, a woman who ran things and did it without complaint. "You came," she said. "Said I would." She almost smiled, that same beginning of one. "My father wants to meet you," she said. "I told him you'd likely come in the spring." "You told him about me." "I told him about Margaret," she said, "which meant telling him about you. He was her family too. He took it well. He's a man who can hold a complicated thing." I nodded. "He's inside," she said. "I'd like to meet him," I said, "in a minute." She waited. There was a thing I'd been turning over since winter, something I'd tried different ways of saying in my head on the walk down from the mountains, and all the ways I'd tried were wrong because they were too many words arranged too carefully. So I didn't say any of those. I just said the plain thing. "I don't know where this goes," I said. "I'm not a young man and I've got very little to offer in the conventional sense. I'm a trapper who lives in a mountain cabin and I'm not much for company. But I came because you said come, and because since you walked down that trail I haven't been the same kind of alone." She was quiet for a moment, looking at me. "Different kind of alone," she said, like she understood exactly what that meant, which I suspected she did. "Yes," I said. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she reached up and touched the front of my coat, the same way she'd done at the fork in the trail, flat-palmed, steady. Both hands this time. She held them there, feeling the solidity of me, and looked at my face the way someone looks at a thing they've been trying to see clearly for a long time. "She was right about you," she said quietly. "The patience, the stillness." A small pause. "She knew what she'd found, even when she couldn't keep it." Something in that went through me in a way I didn't fully account for until later. The idea of being known across a long distance and a long time. The idea of a woman carrying that knowledge through her whole life and leaving it, at the end, to someone who would understand what it was worth. "Come inside," Nora said. "You can meet him. We'll figure out the rest as we go." She dropped her hands and turned, and I walked beside her across the yard toward the lamplight in the window, the garden beds dark on one side and the horses moving in the corrals on the other, and the whole valley settling into the long quiet of a spring evening. Remus trotted ahead of us and sat down at the door. He'd always known how to arrive somewhere first. Her father's name was Emmett, and he was 71 and could not see past the shape of me against the light. But he put out his hand and I took it, and he had the grip of a man who'd worked cattle his whole life, which never entirely leaves the hand. We sat at the kitchen table, and Nora made coffee, and Emmett asked me things in the way of a man sizing up another man without bothering to be indirect about it. Where I'd come from before the mountains. What I'd done. Where I thought things were likely to go. He asked about the trapping, not in a dismissive way, but in the way of a man who'd taken cold and work and weather seriously his whole life and respected it in another. He asked about Margaret, not much. Just whether I'd known she was happy toward the end. I told him I'd believed so, that what Nora had told me suggested a life that had had goodness in it. He received that and nodded and let it settle. After a while Emmett said, "She walked 18 miles in that weather to find you. I want you to know I argued with her about that, and I lost, same as I always lost when she'd made up her mind." "I know the country," Nora said to her coffee. "You nearly lost your fingers," Emmett said without heat. "She nearly lost them in service of something she believed in," I said. "I'm not going to say she was wrong to do it." Emmett went quiet for a moment, then he said, "No. I suppose not." He turned his head slightly in my direction, orienting toward me the way a man does when he's decided something. "You'll stay for supper," he said, not a question. "I'll stay for supper," I said. I stayed a week that first time. Worked with the hands on a fence line that needed mending in the east pasture, because a man who doesn't make himself useful isn't worth his board. By the third day, I'd found the rhythm of the place. In the evenings, I sat with Emmett on the porch if the air wasn't too cold, and he talked about the history of the valley, the history of the ranch, the families that had come and gone, the things that had worked and the things that hadn't. A man of 71 with good memory is a library, and I'd always had time for libraries. He talked and I received it, and he seemed, after the first evening, to appreciate that about me. He'd had conversation makers around him his whole life. He didn't need another one. What he needed, I think, was someone who would sit still and listen with the attention the material deserved. Land history isn't small. It's a record of what people tried and what the land allowed, which is a kind of argument that goes on across decades. Emmett had been a party to that argument his whole adult life, and he had a lot to say about it, and what he mostly got from the ranch hands was polite waiting for him to finish. I wasn't waiting. I was listening, and he could tell the difference. The third evening he said, mid-sentence about a dispute over water rights that had gone badly for a neighbor 20 years prior, "You're not going to leave." He said it the way you'd say the weather is going to hold, not as a question, not as an accusation, just a reading of the situation. "No," I said. He nodded, "Good," and went back to the water rights dispute as if the other thing hadn't been said. Nora and I took a walk along the river on the fourth evening, the two of us and Remus, the sky going orange and pink past the mountains. She told me about the years after Cal died, how she'd had to learn things he'd done without knowing she hadn't known them. How she'd figured out calving season on her on the first year, losing two she shouldn't have lost, and then losing a third and sitting down in the wet spring grass of the south pasture, and staying there a long time until she understood which of her emotions was grief and which was stubbornness, because they felt the same from the inside, and she needed to know which one to act on. And I said, "Stubbornness," she said. "It's almost always stubbornness." I believed her. You could see it, not the hard and brittle kind, but the kind that has give to it, that bends under real weight without snapping. It was in how she moved through the work of the ranch, in how she'd walked 18 miles. She asked me on that same walk what I'd done when Ruth died. Not prying, the way she asked things was never prying, it was just direct. She'd told me something real and she wanted something real back. I thought about how to answer it honestly. "I moved around for a while," I said, "took whatever work was there. Then I went up to the mountains and stopped moving." I paused. Stopping was harder than the moving had been, but better, eventually. She nodded at that and didn't try to improve on it, which was exactly right. We walked another quarter-mile in silence, the kind of silence that's comfortable rather than empty, and then she said, I think the hardest part is when you stop expecting to feel normal again, and then one day you just do, without noticing it had happened. Yes, I said. It feels like a betrayal at first, she said. And then it doesn't. I looked at her. She was watching the river, the last of the sun on the water, and her face was calm and particular in her own. And then it doesn't, I said. I wasn't expecting to, she started and stopped. You weren't expecting to what? To find something worth traveling for, she said. After a while you stop expecting that. I knew the feel of that sentence from the inside. I wasn't expecting it either, I said. She looked at me sideways, that almost smile. You had very little warning, she said. That's true, I said. I came out of a snowdrift. You did. Soaking wet. You were unconscious. Still, she said, and now the smile was real, full, and it changed her whole face, lit it differently, the way a room looks different when someone opens a window in it. It wasn't my best presentation. It was a reasonable one, I said, given the circumstances. She laughed at that. A real laugh, short and clear, and it ran out over the river and the quiet valley and then was gone, and I held on to the sound of it because it was the first time I'd made a woman laugh in a long, long while, and it landed in me somewhere I hadn't known was empty. The last morning of that first visit, before I shouldered my pack to go back up to the high country, she found me at the corral fence watching the horses. Just came and stood beside me, our arms close. You'll come again, she said. I'll come again. In the fall, when you bring the furs down. Before that, if you'll have me. She was quiet a moment. The horses moved in the early light, a bay mare working her way along the fence rail, a gray gelding standing with one hip dropped. I'll have you, she said. I don't know exactly when it became the thing it became. That's not how these things work, at least not for me. There's no single moment you can point to and say, there, that's when. It's a long accumulation of ordinary things, a coffee in the morning, a fence line repaired, an evening where neither of you needs to say much because the company is sufficient. The specific way her hair looks when she's working in the garden and doesn't know you're watching. The way she holds a conversation with Emmett, present but not hovering, attentive without managing. The fact that she never once asked me to be other than what I was, and I noticed this because I'd spent enough of my life around people who did ask that, in the small, persistent way people ask things without saying them. There was an evening in late summer the first year, when we were both out past dark without intending to be. She'd been checking on one of the mares who was close to foaling, and I'd walked out to find her because supper had been ready for an hour. We ended up staying. You stay when a mare is foaling if you've got any sense. We sat on the rail of the foaling stall and watched, and the night was warm and the stars were out, and the mare did what mares do, and by midnight there was a colt with wet legs trying to stand. And Nora was laughing quietly at the colt's indignation at the difficulty of standing, and I was watching her laugh. And it occurred to me that I had not felt this settled, this specifically, precisely located in a moment, in longer than I could honestly account for. Not in years, maybe not in decades. I didn't say any of that. You don't. But I held onto it the way you hold onto a good morning in bad country, carefully, aware that it's rarer than it looks. On the walk back to the house, she reached out and took hold of my arm without looking at me or saying anything. Just took hold of it the way you take hold of a railing in the dark, not from fear, just from the knowledge that it's there and that it's solid. I didn't say anything either. We walked back in the warm dark with the colt making its uncertain sounds behind us and the lamp in the kitchen window ahead, and her hand in the crook of my elbow was the weight of something returned rather than something new. That's the only way I know how to put it, like recognizing a thing you hadn't realized you'd been missing. What I can tell you is that, by the second summer, I was spending more time in the valley than in the mountains. I kept the cabin, I still keep it, still run some of the lines in the hard season, but the valley had become the address in a way nothing had been for many years. There is something to be said for a man knowing where he belongs. I hadn't known for a long time. Not since Ruth died, and arguably not fully even before that, because belonging is not just about a place, but about the particular combination of a place and a person, and a reason for being there that you didn't have to construct or argue yourself into. It's either there or it isn't. With Nora on that land in those years, it was there. Clear as a creek in October, that light before it turns. I learned the ranch the way you learn any piece of ground. Slowly, by walking it in different weather, by understanding where it was weak and where it was strong, where the water sat wrong and where the grass grew best. I wasn't the owner of it, and I didn't pretend to be. But I became useful to it in the way that a man who knows land and work and weather becomes useful, not by telling anyone how to do what they already knew how to do, but by being one more pair of hands with sense behind them when sense was needed. The hands got used to me. That took a month or two. Men who have worked a ranch for years don't warm fast to newcomers, and I didn't push it. I showed up, did the work, asked the right questions and didn't ask the wrong ones, and by fall I was just part of the pattern of the place. Nora watched all of this without comment, which was another thing I appreciated about her. Emmett died in the late winter of the second year. It was a quiet death in his sleep, which is the one people hope for. He'd had the fall season to get used to the shape of things, and I think he died knowing Nora wasn't going to be alone, which is what a father's mind turns to when the time is short. He was a man worth knowing. I'm glad I knew him, even briefly. The spring after, I asked Nora to marry me. At the kitchen table, which is where we'd had most of the real conversations, and I did it plainly without ornamentation. She looked at me. "You're not going to ride up on a horse," she said. "I don't own a horse," I said. "You don't, that's true." She looked down at her coffee and then back up. "Yes," she said. "All right, yes." The minister came out from Harker's Ford on a Tuesday in June, which was the best day anyone had free. Nora wore her good dress, and I wore the coat I'd had for 15 years, which was the best one I had, and we said the words in the front room with two of the ranch hands as witnesses and Remus at the door, because Remus attended all significant events. Afterward, one of the hands brought out a bottle, and we all had a glass on the porch in the long afternoon light, and Nora stood beside me with her shoulder against mine, and her coffee cup held in both hands, her left hand perfectly functional. No sign of those winter-damaged fingers except in very cold weather when they ached a little, and I put my arm around her, and she leaned into it. The weight of her against my side was a particular and familiar thing by then. Unremarkable in the best sense. A thing so present you stop tracking it, the same way you stop hearing the creek after you've lived beside it long enough. It's simply part of the sound of your life. The mountains were clear and blue against the sky to the north. A meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do in June, and the sound of it was clear and carrying across the valley. "She'd be glad," Nora said quietly. I didn't ask who she meant. I knew. "I know," I said. She put her hand flat against my chest, the same way she'd done at the fork in the trail that first winter and in the yard that first spring evening, that flat-palmed, steady touch that was her version of saying the truest thing. I covered it with mine. We stood there in the June afternoon in the country we were going to live in together, and the valley stretched out in all directions, green and deep and particular, and somewhere up in the mountains the old cabin sat tight in its draw with the smoke hole sealed, waiting for winter, doing what cabins do. She'd walked 18 miles through mountain winter to find a man she didn't know. She'd taken her aunt's love and carried it forward into her own, which is not the same thing as inheriting. It's something braver, something that required her to believe, before she had any evidence, that the man her aunt had carried all those years was worth the finding, and then to go and find out. I am, at last count, 61 years old. I have been cold and broke and alone and overlooked, by others and sometimes by myself. I have stood in grief so wide and flat you couldn't see the edges. I have done good work and poor work and some work I'm not proud of, and I have known good people and lost most of them one at a time. I would not have bet money. That morning I heard the snow crack in the ravine and went to look, that what I'd find there was the rest of my life. I would not have bet money, at any of the low points of the years before, that a woman would walk 18 miles through mountain winter carrying a locket with my own photograph in it, and that from that beginning would come the thing I have now. The mornings in the valley, the sound of a good woman's voice in the kitchen when I come in cold. The knowledge, which I carry daily and which I have not yet gotten used to in the way you stop noticing familiar things, that I am known, not for what I was when I was young, not for what I could have been, but for what I actually am, and that what I actually am is, to one specific person on this earth, worth finding. That's not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole of the thing. Remus would have bet money, even that morning. I could see it even then in how he'd whine.